Good morning, friends. Welcome to Sutta Study with Bhante Suddhaso. We're a few minutes late today. We're on Italian time. And this morning we will be studying the Chula Vedalla Sutta, the Majjhima Nikaya 44, and you can find a link of the discourse on the live chat. And good morning to Bhante Suddhaso. All right, so perhaps the mic and we can start. I'll pass it on. Hello, Geeta. Hello, Edward, Jens, Galaxy, Ella, and Michael. Good to see you all, friends.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassam. Good morning, friends. So as mentioned, we'll be going through the first half of the Chula Vedalla Sutta. It's Majjhima Nikaya 44. So yesterday we finished up the Maha Vedalla Sutta, the greater series of questions. This is the Chula Vedalla Sutta, the lesser series of questions. So this one, it's a bit shorter, but it's a similar format where somebody is asking a series of questions and answers are being given, and the questions don't necessarily have much relationship to each other. So it's kind of a mishmash of different subjects and topics. In this case, it takes the form of a lay person named Visakha, and this was a male lay person named Visakha. So this is not the same as the much more well-known female lay disciple named Visakha, who was one of the foremost supporters of the monastic sangha. So this was a male person with the male version of the name, Visakha. And he's asking a series of questions to the Bhikkhuni Dhammadinnā. So Venerable Dhammadinnā was identified by the Buddha as being the best Dhamma teacher of all the Bhikkhunis at the time. So she only appears a very small number of times in the suttas, and this is the most well-known example that we have of her. So I'll go ahead and start reading through the sutta, and periodically I'll give some explanations, and then we'll stop about halfway through to do questions. The sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Rajagaha in the bamboo grove at the squirrel feeding area. Then the lay disciple Visakha approached Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī. After approaching and venerating Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī, he sat to one side. When he was seated to one side, Visakha said to Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī, "Noble lady, it is said, self-identity, self-identity. Noble lady, what is called self-identity by..." And so that thunking noise in the background was the sound of the cat trying to jump up on the windowsill and failing terribly and then falling down. So those who are familiar with the resident monastery cat will not be surprised by this. He's
at least
not
graceful cat.
Yeah, so whoever said graceful as a cat was not talking about this cat. Anyway, so coming back to the sutta, when he was seated to one side, Visakha said to Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī, "Noble lady, it is said, self-identity, self-identity. Noble lady, what is called self-identity by the Blessed One?" So the Pali word translated here as self-identity is sakkaya, which usually people know of this word because the first of the 10 fetters, and the most important of the 10 fetters, is sakkaya ditthi. So the viewpoint or belief that the 5 khandhas are who we are. It's the belief that the body is me, or feelings are me, or recognition patterns are me, or mental objects and formations and activities are me, or consciousness is me. So that's Sakkaya Ditthi. It's this mistaken viewpoint that unenlightened beings have, which prevent them from seeing reality as it is. So the critical practice to become a stream enterer is to see through and abandon Sakkaya Ditthi, the belief that the 5 components of mind and body are who and what we are. So then it's necessary to understand what Sakkaya is. What is it that we're trying to abandon? And it gets translated a number of different ways. Personality view, identity, what are some other ones? Anyway, that's translated here as self-identity, which is reasonable enough. The word actually comes from, there's a couple ways of deriving the etymology of the word. So the second part, kaya, literally means body, but it appears to be, it can also mean group. So it appears to refer to the whole group of components of being, so body and mind, not just body. And the prefix could be sang, which means self. So self body, self group, perceiving the group that we think of as ourself. So the group of physical and mental components. Or it can mean existent or actual. So perceiving the group of components as being our actual true nature, as being real existent things which define who and what we are. I find the second and third explanation a little bit doubtful. I think most likely the prefix here is in fact sayang, which means self. So self body, self group, identifying body and mind as oneself. So once again, translated here simply as self-identity. So Venerable Dhammadinnā replies, Sarvasaka, these 5 aggregates affected by clinging are called self-identity by the Blessed One. The body aggregate affected by clinging, the feeling aggregate affected by clinging, the recognition aggregate affected by clinging, the thought aggregate affected by clinging, the consciousness aggregate affected by clinging. Sarvasaka, these 5 aggregates affected by clinging are called self-identity by the Blessed One. So here she's listing the 5 khandhas, which these days I translate khandha as component. This is one of my older translations, which is why you see the term aggregate. So I use that term because it's already a widely known and recognized word in Buddhism. And in fact, to me, the word aggregate has one and only one meaning, which is khandha. I never, ever, ever use the word aggregate in ordinary English speech. And I don't think I've ever even seen it used in ordinary English anywhere ever. So as far as I'm concerned, aggregate is just a word which is synonymous with the word khandha, and therefore is a meaningless word without knowing the meaning of the word khandha. Ayasoma doesn't like this because I think there's an Italian word that they use.
Aggregato.
Yeah, aggregato, which means, what does it mean?
Aggregate.
Anyway, so these days I translate khandha as component because that's much more central to its meaning. The 5 khandhas are the 5 components of our psychophysical being, the 5 components of being. So the 5 are body, so our physical components, feeling, which is the experience of pleasant, painful, and neutral, recognition, that's sanya. So recognition is the process through which we label, identify, and determine objects. Sankhara is mental activities, mental objects, mental patterns. Translated here as thought, which is an insufficient translation, but reasonable enough. And finally, consciousness, or vijnana, which is awareness of sensory domains. And the qualifying statement that she makes through all of this is affected by clinging. So in Pali, for each one of these, it's simply upadana kanda. So kanda is component, and upadana is clinging or grasping. So it's the body component when there's clinging involved. So the body component, which is subject to clinging. So it's when we are grasping at the body, when we are grasping at the mind, that it becomes a fetter. It's when we're grasping at body and mind that it is the basis for self-identity, and therefore the foundation stone of all of our delusion. So that's the key element here. So it's not body and mind that are the problem per se. They're symptoms of the problem, but they aren't the problem themselves. It's the grasping and clinging in relationship to the 5 components of body and mind. That's the problem. That's what we call self-identity. So Sarvasaka says, excellent, noble lady. That's sadhu aya. Sadhu aya. Excellent, noble lady. After delighting and rejoicing in Dhammadinnā Bhikkhunī's statement, Vasaka asked another question. Noble lady, it is said, the origin of self-identity. The origin of self-identity. Noble lady, what is called the origin of self-identity by the Blessed One? And she answers, Sarvasaka, there is craving, which produces further existence, is accompanied by delight and passion, and seeks delight in various places. Namely, craving for sensuality, craving for existence, and craving for non-existence. Sarvasaka, this is called the origin of self-identity by the Blessed One. In other words, she's pointing here back to craving. Why is it that we grasp at body and mind? Well, craving for sensuality. We want sensual experiences, and it's awfully hard to have sensual experiences without body and mind. Impossible, in fact. Craving for existence. So we want to have self-existence. We want to exist. We want to have something which we identify as. So that's why we look for something to identify as. That's why we look for body and mind. And finally, craving for non-existence. So the Pali word here is vibhava tanha. So the craving for vibhava. So bhava means existence, and vi means separate or apart from. So wanting to be apart from existence. And this is usually taken to mean wanting to have no existence at all, so complete non-existence. But it can also mean wanting to avoid particular forms of existence. So bhava tanha is desire, and vibhava tanha is aversion. Bhava tanha is wanting a certain state of being. Vibhava tanha is wanting to avoid states of being. Again, whether specific ones or all states of existence in general. Both of these are based upon the perspective of me. I want to be that. I want to not be that. It's all based upon I want. It's all based upon me. So there has to be a sense of who I am in order to say, well, I don't want to exist. Or there has to be latching onto a sense of self in order for there to be, well, I want myself to be like this or like that. So then this craving for existence or craving for non-existence is both built upon the belief in self-existence and continues to fuel and build up the belief in self-existence. So then Visakha asks, noble lady, it is said, the cessation of self-identity. The cessation of self-identity. Noble lady, what is called the cessation of self-identity by the Blessed One? In other words, how do we get over this mistaken view that body and mind are me? How do we get past that? And she answers, Sarvasaka, the remainderless fading away and cessation of that craving, giving it up, relinquishing it, releasing it, and being detached from it. Sarvasaka, this is called the cessation of self-identity by the Blessed One. So pretty straightforward, letting go of craving, letting go of that desire for sensuality, that desire to exist, and also the desire to not exist. By releasing those desires, then the underlying sense of self-existence will dissipate. Minor translation point, again, this being one of my older translations, I had translated the word viraga as fading away. These days, I'm always translating viraga as dispassion, because in fact, this is the literal meaning of the word. Viraga means no lust, no passion, without lust. So viraga means dispassion. And I found that every single place in the suttas, viraga can be translated quite satisfactorily as dispassion. So I veered away from this convention of sometimes translating it as fading. So these days I would say through dispassion, there is the remainderless cessation of craving. That's how I would translate this phrase these days, which I think is much closer to the intended meaning. So Sarvasaka then asks, noble lady, it is said, the path of practice which leads to the cessation of self-identity. The path of practice which leads to the cessation of self-identity. Noble lady, what is called the path of practice which leads to the cessation of self-identity by the Blessed One? And she answers, Sarvasaka, this very noble eightfold path has been called the path of practice which leads to the cessation of self-identity by the Blessed One. Namely, right perspective, right attitude, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So here she's saying that the way to let go of our mistaken view of self-being is through practicing the Noble Eightfold Path. So those of you who are sharp might notice that the format that she's presented, the format that's been gone through here, is exactly the same as the Four Noble Truths. So what is dukkha? What is the cause of dukkha? What is the cessation of dukkha? What is the path which leads to the cessation of dukkha? Well, it's the same. It's just here it's self-identity, which is in the place of dukkha. So that's also indicating that self-identity itself is dukkha. Self-identity itself is the source of dukkha, the experience of dukkha. Which is interesting because we often tend to think that our self-identity is something wonderful. It's something delightful, like snuggling a warm cat in your lap. But actually it's not, it's dukkha. Self-identity is dukkha, just like cats, also dukkha. So then Sarvasaka asks another question. He asks, noble lady, is that craving identical with the five aggregates? Or is craving separate from the five aggregates? And she answers, Sarvasaka, that craving is not identical with the five aggregates, and it is also not separate from the five aggregates. Sarvasaka, the interest and passion as regards the five aggregates is the clinging there. In other words, you can have khandhas, components of body and mind, without craving. Because craving is not the same as the five khandhas. So an enlightened being is still manifesting the five khandhas, but there's no craving involved. But craving cannot be said as separate from the five khandhas because craving is always in relationship to the five khandhas. It's always wanting something in relationship to the five khandhas. So it can't be described as something completely separate from the five khandhas either. So then he asks, noble lady, how is their belief in self-identity? So that's sakkaya ditthi, the term that I referred to earlier. It's translated here as belief in self-identity, sakkaya ditthi. And she answers, here Sarvasaka, an unlearned ordinary person, that's asuttava patujana, an unlearned Aya Soma is nodding and smiling because she's in a Suttava Patujana. So am I, by the way. Or some people call us Suttava Patujana, and that we've got some learning, but we're still unenlightened. But that term doesn't appear in the suttas. In the sutta, there's only... Oh, wait, no, I'm wrong. Anyway, in the suttas, there's Asuttava Patujana, which is unlearned ordinary person, and Suttava Arya Savaka, which is a learned disciple of the noble ones. Anyway, so she says, here is Sarvasaka, an unlearned ordinary person, such as the monastery cat, who does not see noble beings, who has not mastered the teachings of noble beings, who is undisciplined in the teachings of noble beings, who does not see good people, has not mastered the teachings of good people, and is undisciplined in the teachings of good people, regards the body as his self, or the body as owned by his self, or the body as contained within his self, or his self as contained within the body. And the same for the other four khandhas. So regarding feeling, recognition, thoughts, or consciousness as oneself, or any of those four as owned by oneself, or contained within oneself, or oneself as contained within that. So she says, Sarvasaka, it is in this way that there is belief in self-identity. So here we see, so body as oneself, body is owned by oneself, body as contained within oneself, or self is contained within the body. So that's 4 modes for the 5 khandhas. So this is sometimes called the 20 forms of self-identity. So these 4 attitudes towards each of the 5 khandhas. So regarding the body as oneself, so you think, this is me. This body is me. Regarding it as owned by oneself, so you're thinking, this body is mine. Regarding the body as contained within oneself, so thinking, I have this vast soul, and within it is the body. Or thinking the self is contained within the body, so thinking, my soul resides within this body. So those are the 4 modes, and then applying the same to each of the other 4 khandhas. So minor translation point. So here it says, one who does not see noble beings. I've also seen that translated as one who has no regard for noble beings, which is a bit more interpretive of a translation, but which indicates not necessarily that you don't physically see noble beings or good people. It's that you have no regard for them. You disregard them. You're not interested. You don't necessarily have any particular respect or appreciation for good people. So then he asks, noble lady, how is there no belief in self-identity? And she replies, here is Sarvasaka, a learned disciple of the noble ones. So there's a typo in this translation here, which I'll fix later. She says, a learned disciple of the noble ones, one who sees noble beings, has mastered their teachings, is well disciplined in their teachings, who sees good people, has mastered their teachings, and is well disciplined in their teachings, does not regard the body as his self, does not regard the body as owned by oneself, does not regard the body as contained within oneself, and does not regard oneself as contained within the body. And the same for the other 4 khandhas as well. And she says, Sarvasaka, it is in this way that there is no belief in self-identity. So then Sarvasaka changes topics. He asks, noble lady, what is the Noble Eightfold Path? And she says, Sarvasaka, it is this very Noble Eightfold Path, namely right perspective, right attitude, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. He asks, noble lady, is the Noble Eightfold Path conditional or non-conditional? Is it sankata or asankata? Is it conditioned or not conditioned? Is it made up of sankharas or not made up of sankharas? In other words, he's asking, is it part of samsara or is it part of nibbana? And she replies, Sarvasaka, the Noble Eightfold Path is conditional. It is sankata. It's made up of sankharas, which means it's provisional. It means it's part of the provisional world. It's part of the conditional world. It's part of samsara. It's a part of samsara which leads towards nibbana. It's an element of the conditioned which leads towards the element of the unconditioned. But it is still conditioned. It's sankharas. It's not the absolute. It's not the goal. It's something that we use in order to make progress towards the absolute, but it is not the absolute. Then he asks, Noble Lady, is the Noble Eightfold Path included in the three aggregates? So three aggregates here refers to sila, samadhi, and panya. So morality, concentration, and wisdom. So not the same as the five aggregates of body and mind. Or the three aggregates included in the Noble Eightfold Path. And she says, Sirvasaka, the Noble Eightfold Path is not included in the three aggregates. The three aggregates are included in the Noble Eightfold Path. So that's an interesting statement. She's saying that if you just say sila, samadhi, and panya, that's good, but it's not necessarily giving you all the information that you need about the Noble Eightfold Path. Whereas if you explain the Noble Eightfold Path in detail, then that does include all the information you need about sila, samadhi, and panya. So she says, Sirvasaka, right speech, right action, and right livelihood are included in the virtue aggregate. Right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration are included in the concentration aggregate. Right perspective and right attitude are included in the wisdom aggregate. So I also find this an interesting statement here. So right speech, right action, and right livelihood being sila, morality, that's pretty clear enough. Right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration being included under samadhi, though. That's a little more interesting. So right effort is the effort to remove unwholesome mind states and cultivate wholesome mind states. So that's necessary if you want to get samadhi. It's impossible to have strong samadhi if your mind is overcome by unwholesome mind states, such as attachment to cats. Makes it very hard to get deep samadhi. Ayasoma has the cat on her lap, in case you're wondering, and she seems more interested in the cat than in the Dhamma talk.
True.
She claims it's not true, but we all know it's true. Right mindfulness also is necessary for samadhi. Your mindfulness has to be very strong if you want to enter jhana. But also, you need to be very clearly, intensely aware of your meditation object in order to get any degree of samadhi. So mindfulness is a critical element of samadhi as well. And finally, right perspective and right attitude are included in the wisdom aggregate. So right perspective or right view is definitely a function of wisdom. The way it's defined is always in terms of wisdom. It's interesting, though, that right attitude is included under wisdom by her. So right attitude is the attitude of renunciation, the attitude of non-harming, and the attitude of non-cruelty. So why would that be included under wisdom? Well, because this is the function of wisdom. When we see the world with wisdom, then we have no interest in being attached to things. So renunciation is natural for one who is wise. When we understand the connectivity of all beings, the interconnectedness through karma of all beings, then we naturally will not harm any being or be cruel towards any being. So the three right attitudes arise naturally from the mind of wisdom. That said, I could see an argument being made for including right attitude in the sila component, because that's also a function of sila. So then he asks, Noble Lady, what is concentration? What are the objects of concentration? What phenomena are the supports of concentration? And what is the development of concentration? So here he's asking about samadhi. And the word translated here as object, by the way, is nimitta. So samadhi nimitta. What is the samadhi nimitta? What is the object of samadhi? So people often ask me about nimitta. What is nimitta? How does it relate to our meditation practice? Well, in the suttas, the word nimitta just means whatever you're focusing on, whatever you're paying attention to, whatever object of awareness you're using. So In later apocryphal literature, the word nimitta came to be defined in a completely different way. But in the suttas, it just means whatever you're paying attention to. So she answers, mental focus is concentration. So that's chittasa ekaggata, which these days I would translate as mental unification. So ekaggata means come together to one. So come into oneness, unified. So mental unification is concentration. A very simple definition of samadhi, which I find quite useful, mental unification. The four establishments of mindfulness are the objects of concentration. Again, this is very clear here that the word nimitta does not mean bright lights appearing when you get close to jhana, which is the apocryphal translation, apocryphal definition. It just means whatever you're focusing on, whatever you're using as an object of attention in order to develop samadhi. So the four satipatthanas, this collection of ways of relating to body and mind in ways that support the development of samadhi and insight. And she says the four right exertions are the support of concentration. So samappadana, the four right exertions. And we should actually give a talk on that one of these days. So I'm going to make a note of that, to give a talk on the four right exertions. And she says, practicing, developing, and repeating these is the development of concentration. In other words, to just keep doing this over and over again. Unify your mind, focus on the satipatthanas, and keep developing the four right exertions, the four right efforts. Then he asks, noble lady, how many formations are there? So the word here is sankhara. And I'm going to go through this a little bit and then explain how I think the word sankhara is being used here. So she says, Sarvasaka, there are these three formations, the body formation, the speech formation, and the mind formation. So this is one place where I think the word sankhara is best translated as activities rather than as formations. So he's asking, how many kinds of activities are there? And I would say there are three kinds of activities: physical activities, verbal activities, and mental activities. I think that in this case, it makes more sense than formations. Again, these days, I don't normally use the word formation for sankhara because I feel it's too passive, it's insufficient. And realistically, most of the time, the word sankhara just shouldn't be translated because translations of the word sankhara always seem to miss the meaning of it. I've never seen a good translation of the word sankhara. I've only seen translations that work in certain limited contexts, but never a good overall translation. So he asks, noble lady, what is the physical activity? What are physical activities? What are verbal activities? What are mental activities? And she replies, Sarvasaka, breathing in and out is the physical activity. Thought and consideration are the verbal activities. Recognition and feeling are the mental activities. And he asks, noble lady, why is breathing in and out physical activities? Why is thought and examination verbal activities? Why is recognition and feeling mental activities? So this is a bit of an unusual way of dividing up body, speech, and mind. Identifying breathing as body, thinking as speech, and recognition and feeling as mind. This is a bit unusual. For example, thinking we would normally classify as mind. And body, of course, is a lot more than just breathing. So she answers, Sarvasaka, breathing in and breathing out are bodily phenomena bound to the body. Therefore, breathing in and out is physical activity. Previously, one thinks and considers, and afterwards one breaks into speech. Therefore, thought and examination are verbal activity. So she's pointing to the fact that what we think in our mind is the precursor to what we say. So speech is the product of mental activity. Speech is the product of what we're doing with our thoughts, how we're moving our mind. And she says, recognition and feeling are mental phenomena bound to the mind. Therefore, recognition and feeling is mental activity. So the mind formation, as it says here. And I think at this time we should go ahead and pause and switch to Q&A. So if there's any questions or comments, now's your opportunity to ask things.
All right, thank you so much, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So there are some amusing comments on the cat, Stan the cat, who also distracted us a few times during this Dhamma talk. He's a very clumsy cat. Bernadette says, I feel like cats should be the exception.
Exception to what? Craving and clinging?
Perhaps. Yes. And yes, his name is Dan, Michael. But Michael had a question on the top. He says, I think of aggregate as a set of things that make up something. A car is an aggregate of parts. I think of components as the parts that make up the aggregate. Wheels, axles, doors, motor, etc. are the components that in the aggregate make up the car. So that's my argument for aggregate. I always thought of each of the 5 aggregates being made up of components that we can take apart, thus their lack of self-nature. Is this thinking correct?
I can totally see that perspective. Yeah, I can see that being a good way of relating to it. I'm still a bit uncomfortable with translating the word khanda as aggregate. But yeah, I can see that argument. Yeah. Yeah,
that's exactly my understanding as well. Because aggregato is already like in Italian, it's a set of components to begin with. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think Bhante Sujato was translating it as pile.
Pile.
The 5 piles, which I also find cute, but I'm not a huge fan of either. No, I'm just going to keep using component. Yeah.
Stubborn.
Because to me, something being a component doesn't mean that it's not itself made up of multiple components. So you might say, well, my computer has 3 components. It has the monitor, it has the CPU, it has the keyboard. Well, the monitor is made up of a lot of components as well. So you can say, well, my monitor has so and so many components. And the CPU, of course, is made up of a lot of components. You can say, well, my CPU has a lot of components. And then each one of those is made up of components. And ultimately, everything is made up of subatomic particles. And so everything is made up of components. So I don't see anything wrong with saying, well, there's the 5 components, body, feeling, etc. And body is also made up of components. I don't see anything wrong with saying it that way. You have thoughts?
Actually, I do, and it does bring up something interesting, right? So khanda, the clump, an aggregate is a collection. But when we say the 5 aggregates. So maybe it'd be more accurate to say the 5 in aggregate. Like, so I actually, the 5 components does make more sense than the 5 aggregates. It would be like the 5 components in aggregate. Gotcha. Make a lot more sense. So yeah, that's it. Maybe it's a case of awkward wording in English.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting that the word khanda in the suttas, its main use, other than referring to the 5 components of body and mind, its main other use is to mean a tree trunk. So that also gives me a sense of like the 5 pillars of personal existence. Just like a tree trunk is this single thick solid thing, which is the pillar which the tree depends upon. It's that solid central core which the tree grows on. In the same way, the 5 khandas are the 5 solid central cores which we build our sense of self-identity on. the 5 pillars of self-identity.
The 5 tree trunks subject to clinging. All right. And Michael is also saying the Pali English Dictionary says the same and contains an essay of sorts in place of a word definition. Sankara SP, I'm not quite sure. I think it was referred to something that you were saying back then. Anyway, Bradley's saying, sometimes I consider thinking as a sort of internal speech, like this sort of running dialogue.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Jens says, Bhante, thank you for the explanation of the Noble Eightfold Path being conditional. It helped me understand this part of the sutta. And Mark says, so is it safe to say that sense of self is completely made up of the 5 components?
Not entirely. So this is clear when the 10 fetters are explained in relationship to the 4 stages of awakening. So a stream enterer has abandoned Sakaya Ditti. So they've abandoned the belief, I am the components of body and mind. But there still persists a subtle sense of self-existence, which is not connected to any of the 5 components in particular. But there's still this sense, I exist, but without it being tied to anything in specific. So Sakaya Ditti is specific self-existence. Asmimana is non-specific self-existence. So that's this subtle aroma of conceit, which persists right up until one becomes an arhat. So the simile the Buddha uses is the mind of an ordinary unenlightened being is like dirty clothing. The mind of a stream enterer is like after you wash the clothing, and the clothing is technically clean, but there's still this lingering odor in the clothes. So I'm reminded of at Abhayagiri, somebody came who had never used natural laundry detergent before. He'd only used like heavy chemical laundry soap, which is filled with all kinds of artificial fragrances. So the first time he used like natural unscented laundry soap, afterwards, I remember him smelling his clothes and going, it might be clean, but it sure doesn't smell clean. Because to his mind, smelling clean meant it had to smell like chemical fragrances. Anyway, so the simile the Buddha gives is, so the mind of a stream enterer, once returner, or non-returner, it's like clothing which has been washed, so it's clean, but it still has this odor to it. And the odor only eventually fades over time. He actually describes putting the clothing in a sweet casket. So I think in the old days, they would put clothing in a cedar chest because the cedar wood would absorb the fragrance out of the clothing, absorb that residual unpleasant smell from the clothing. And then so the mind of a fully enlightened being is when even that faint residual odor of conceit has faded away. So that's how there's a sense of self which is not specifically connected to any of the 5 khandhas. But that's much more subtle. So you don't work with that until you're a non-returner. So those of us who are not even stream enterers, we're still working with trying to deal with the coarser identification of I am this body and mind. Okay.
And Mark is asking, so in stream enters, what is that subtle sense of identity connected to? Does the Buddha ever say, other than an aroma, where does the conceit lie?
Yeah, so I don't think it has a location. So prior to stream entry, our sense of self-identity is clearly connected to one or more of the 5 khandhas. But after stream entry, it doesn't really have a location as far as I can tell. It's just this general persistent feeling, I exist, I am. There is a separate, distinct being, me. But there's no specific identity as to what that me is. there's the recognition that the components of body and mind are not me, but there continues to be this sense, nonetheless, I exist. Yeah, the Buddha doesn't go into any more detail than that, as far as I can recall.
And did you answer what is the subtle sense of identity connected to?
Yeah, I just answered that.
Bernadette says, this is a sidebar, but I'm curious. Is the use of numbers in this teaching significant? Leads to a larger question. Are numbers held sacred in Buddhism? And might you ever give a talk about that?
So to answer your question, no, no, and no. So numbers are not particularly significant in the sutta or anywhere in Buddhism for that matter. Rather, they are used heavily because they're an aid to memory. So for example, there are 10 fetters. So that means then I start listing them and I get up to 7 or 8 or 9 and I'm like, oh gosh, I know there's 10, but I'm missing 1 or 2 of them. And then I rack my brain and try to remember what the other 2 are, or you ask another monk what the other 2 are, or you look it up in a book. But knowing that there's 10 fetters, that makes sure that you don't forget things. So Buddhism is filled with numerical lists. Some are very common, others less so. But it's a way of making sure that we remember all the components of things. But the numbers themselves don't have any significance. So it's not like the number 3, 5, and 8 have any real significance. And in fact, you can find lists of just about every number up to 12 or so. There's a lot of lists of everything from 1 to 12. Beyond 12, there's not as many. There's a few other bigger lists like 18 and 36 and so on. But mostly it's from 1 to 12. There's lots of lists. Yeah, it's just an aid to memory. Though there's an amusing story of there was, when Ajahn Sumedho was living in Thailand, there was a man who was coming to the monastery and he was telling one of the other monks, he's like, oh, I love coming to listen to Ajahn Sumedho's Dhamma talks because he always gives really good lottery numbers. And the monk is like, what are you talking about? Ajahn Sumedho never talks about the lottery and he never gives out lottery numbers. And the guy's like, yeah, he does. Like yesterday, he mentioned the Noble Eightfold Path and the 4 Noble Truths. And then the next day, the numbers 8 and 4 came up in the lottery. But again, just a coincidence. We're not, there's no system of numerology in Buddhism, as there is in some other religious systems. Some of them have a built-in system of numerology, but not in Buddhism.
All right, and Mark is asking, why the word conceit?
It's a bit of a, maybe not the best translation. The Pali word is usually mana. So mana, there's 3 main forms that we see of the word mana. So there's mana, which is the simple form. Atimana, which means excessive mana, excessive conceit, and then asmi mana, which is the conceit, I exist, I am. So conceit is self-centeredness. Conceit is the fixation on me. So everybody has ordinary mana, ordinary conceit, the ordinary self-centeredness of unenlightened beings. Atimana is excessive self-centeredness. So like really strong arrogance, really strong conceit, really strong self-centeredness. And then asmimana is just that the belief I exist, I am. So this is the most subtle and the most foundational form of self-centeredness. It's the belief in self-existence. So yeah, the word mana usually, go ahead.
I just looked up English word conceit in the dictionary. One of the third, like the first ones is this person's conceited, etc. But the third one actually fits with manyati, imagination, fancy.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah. In fact, it's probably from the same root in Pali. So maneti means to imagine something, to think of something. conceive of something. So it's conceiving of a sense of self, thinking of a sense of self, thinking about me, thinking of the world in terms of me.
Creating a character.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. And Kam says, haha, that's so true. My cousins would have done that, interpreted monks' teachings into lottery numbers. Good times. And Michael says, thank you, Venerables. When will you open the monastery for visits, or is it unknown at this time? Well, actually, we're planning starting July 4th, right? Saturday, July 4th, to have Saturday meditation outside, so in the garden. And then we're open to private visits. So if you want to come off hours, send us an email at info@buddhistinsights.com, and we can you can arrange a time if you want to come and visit the monastery. We're not currently like open full-fledged to the public, so we're figuring out what is the best and safest course of action. But when it's just a small group of people, it's more manageable and we can figure out things. But large crowds, not at the moment. And the largest is what we're going to do outside, which is basically first come, first basis while doing social distancing. So people will have distance one from the other while meditating in the yard. But there's a lot of space outside. Indoors, there's less space. So it's a little bit more complicated. But if you'd like to come and visit, please do. Just info@buddhistinsights.com. And yes, Bradley, thank you. Who's reminding to bring a blanket and bug spray. So if you live around, bug spray is in a repellent. Yes, not as a killer of bugs, but anti-mosquito. And yeah, you can just bring blanket and bug spray. And starting July 4th, every Saturday evening, we will be there. I don't think cushions will be provided because of the whole pandemic situation. And we don't have many things organized in that respect. So it's easier if you bring your own cushion. BYOC, bring your own cushion.
BYOZ. Your own zafu.
Oh, BYOZ, yeah, BYOZ. And what time it will be? Will it be 7 p.m. Bhante or 7?
Yeah, 7 p.m.
7 p.m. So the first one, July 4th, 7 p.m. We will put it on the schedule. Hopefully this morning during the work period.
Okay. Any other questions?
I think that's all.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for Sutta study this morning. We will continue studying this Sutta next week on Wednesday. So this evening, any questions you might have on Dhamma or Buddhist-related things, you can bring them to Monk Chat at 7:30 p.m. New York City time. And then tomorrow, actually, we'll have a special afternoon workshop called Tea with Mara from 3 p.m. to 5, something like that, or 3:30 to 5:30. I don't remember, but it will be also popping up on the schedule this morning. And otherwise, every week we meet morning and evening. So morning at 8 a.m. and evening 7:30 p.m. For Dhamma. All right. Well, hope you have a great rest of the day and a great in general. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.